Hello guys, and welcome to Supreme Ruler Ultimate. Today we have the long-awaited supply guide. Supply is a value in Supreme Ruler that affects the amount of resources that a military unit or your industries on a hex receive. And there's a couple ways to view it, one way being the supply filter, which is down here, which paints a pretty picture, as we can see here, not just of our own country. Let's turn off line of sight and look around at other countries, and we can see, especially looking at Russia, there's some big gaps in the world, and if we have less or more, there will be a lighter or brighter color to represent that as well. You could also hover over any hex in the game, and you'll see this rectangular window pop up here, which shows the exact percentage of supply on said hex. If I click that hex and go to the land tab, we can see a bar down here representing supply as well. Hover over that to get the percentage. If you're already lost on anything I'm talking about, you likely haven't seen my other Supreme Ruler guides yet. Go check out the cards at the top right of the video to get access to the playlist that has all my previous guides, which should catch you up to speed up to this point in case you need a helping hand on a few of the terms or concepts that I'm going to be referring to in this video. So now you know what supply is and how to see supply. Now, where does supply come from? Well, it comes from facilities that generate it. Such facilities include, but are not limited to, cities, for example. The size of a city, so the amount of population on the hex with the urban facility, affect the amount of supply that it produces. Do note, population only correlates to the production of supply when on a hex with some sort of urban facility like a city or a town. If there's a hex like this or this or this that does not have an urban facility like a town on it, population has nothing to do with supply at that point. The supply produced by any facility, by the way, is determined by your total infrastructure rating in your social spending, which can be increased by increasing spending in infrastructure or getting technologies that affect it. 100% is the base rating that the production that every single facility that produces supply will be based off of. So, for example, in terms of urban facilities, the production scale goes, and I'm just taking these numbers from the wiki, a small village produces 30% of a hex's total supply, a village produces 30%, a small town, a town, and a city produce 40%, a metropolis and a large city produce 50%, a mega city and the capital city produce 60%. And now all of these are scales of population within a hex, except for capital cities, which are more determined by you depending on your game settings. But there are other things other than towns that produce supply. For example, industrial complexes produce 10% of the maximum supply of a hex. And if we move closer to the ocean, we'll find there are oceanic complexes as well. These produce 60% of the total supply of a hex. That covers all the buildings that can be built upon in terms of supply. There's also, if we go looking somewhere, a military complex right here. This produces 30% of the total supply that a hex can support. There are also much rarer military, let me find them, fortifications, fortresses here. These produce, let me just plop one down. These produce 50% of the total supply a hex can have. And then that covers every base building of a hex that can produce supply. But there are also buildings that you place on top of these buildings that can produce more. For example, a seaport can produce 40% of the supply in a hex. An air base, this is an airfield for example, can produce 40% of the supply in a hex. Do note, sea piers and airfields do not produce anything, only seaports and air bases. Seaports and air bases can only contribute their supply to a hex once, whereas if you built a supply depot, which we can find down here, you can stack as many of these as you can fit onto one hex, and they would all contribute their supply to the hex. They're stackable, whereas seaports and air bases are not. And then that finishes covering every building that produces supply. Now, supplies are consumed, as I said, by industries and units. Let's start consumption with facilities because that's just easier to cover. your industries, such as your consumer goods plants or your coal or petrol power production plants, do require an amount of supply. Basically, if you go to build a building, let's for example look at a consumer goods factory here, it says it has a max possible output of 775,000 tons. That is not how much it will produce. That's how much it would produce if it was on a hex with 100% supply. Now, the chances of that being the case are actually very low. Getting 100% on every hex is not necessarily something you'll ever see unless you really go out of your way to make it happen. We'll talk more about that later. But basically, if you have a hex that has 50% supply and you have all the required input goods for the production of consumer goods, then this consumer goods factory would produce exactly half of the max possible output that it says it would produce. So increasing supply in an area can overall benefit the production and efficiency of your economy as a whole. But now over to the other part of consumption, military units. The reason that you're more likely listening to this guide to begin with, military units also consume supply, especially when they fire at an opponent, but also if they're moving. That latter one only applies to motorized or mechanized units or anything that actually requires fuel to get around. The only other instance of units consuming supply comes from initial deployment. If something has a cargo capacity, they need to fill that up with whatever supplies they're carrying. They will usually automatically do that, draining from your resource stockpiles and the supply in that hex, just like restocking any other unit with fuel or ammunition would go. If a facility has no access to supply, it will simply not produce. If a unit has no access to supply, it will not refuel or rearm when necessary in that hex. But with high enough ROE settings, they might actually retreat to somewhere with supply in order to do that. Or supply-based units might be sent to them in order to refuel them where they are. Next, we'll talk about how supply spreads, because not every hex produces supply. It's obvious that this New Orleans hex produces supply. It's obvious this one produces supply. It's not obvious whether or not these ones would, right? There's nothing here except roads, and over here there's just forests. Well, these do not produce supply, but as we can see here, and as we can see colored in, this is the supply map, there are supplies on these hexes. That is because supplies that are made actually travel out from a source to reach other hexes. That's also why we can find very specific areas that have little to no or no supply at all. Now, the first thing to note is that supply spread is not cumulative. If I build 3 supply hubs at full capacity here, here, and here, they will not spread together over this region for a higher max potential. In fact, a hex only has the ability to draw supplies from one other hex other than itself. So, for example, this hex right here has an industrial complex, meaning it produces 10% of the supply that it needs in optimal conditions. But let's say there was a supply hub right next to it, somewhere around here, that produced 100% supply. You'd actually see that spill over, and this would probably look more like 80 or 90% supply. Because what it's going to do is it's essentially going to throw out its own supply value and take from the nearest hub. And now if there's a supply hub right here next to it with 80% of max supply and one further over here with 100%, it's going to actually draw from the one with 80% next to it instead of the 100%, because the 100% is going to degrade so much by here that there will be less left from this point. But the closer one will have a lot more spilling in. Basically, it will draw from the highest nearby source that it can find. It will search as far out as it needs to find a higher source other than itself, but there may not be any supplies that even reach a hex, and that's when you reach hexes like this that have no supply at all, because no hubs or hexes at all can actually reach their supply out this far. Due to the way that it works here, usually it is better, as a result, to build up singular supply hubs that have 100% and do your best to connect them to places that need it, rather than surround important locations with smaller hubs that have more like 40 or 50%. The 100% will be more cost effective and will actually get more supply to your affected regions than the alternatives. Next, we talk about how supply itself actually moves in relation to what's in its way. So let's say I went ahead and I built a supply hub. Let's just, for example, put an air base here. We have now 30% from the military complex and 40% from the air base. That means this hex already has 70% of its total supply production. If I built this on a military fortress instead, we're talking 90%. Now, how will this actually spread from here? Well, it's affected by a number of variables. What you ideally want are flat terrains that do not have any high ground, close combat, or defensive terrain that intercepts them. As we can see, there's a number of those things here. Sometimes you just can't really help it, but these things will slow down your movement of supply, as will rivers and coastlines. Come on, let me click the button. There you go. Like this right here. If there wasn't a bridge here, then supply wouldn't effectively cross this point. Because there are forests to the west of this hub, that means supply would travel west far less efficiently than it would east, where there are merely semi-deserts. If I had placed it over here instead in the plains, it would spread way more flawlessly through the plains, but run into some issues on these light forests, which are also elevated terrains, as we can see right here. These are technically mountains that would also slow this down further. The denser and higher and less hospitable of a terrain, the less supply will travel through it. But there is a way around this. Rails and roads. Now, rails and roads have their uses regardless of supply movement, but they were originally designed primarily with movement of supply in mind. Originally, roads were for movement speed and supply, whereas rails were just for supply. That is why rails are so much cheaper than roads are. If we look here, we have about kind of a third, almost a third of the total rails as we have roads. But if you look at the money spent, it's not even remotely what you'd think it would be. Like, we're talking roads are being 10 times or more expensive than rails per hex. That is because rails initially did not have the ability to transport units. They do now, so their value is increased, but their actual budget maintenance has not increased. So for actually trying to spread supply from one point to another faster, the more cost-effective solution is still rails, and it's even more so rails at this point than roads regarding what benefits you get from them. Stacking rails on roads will not provide an additional benefit to supply spread, only to movement options. But essentially, rails and roads are a way to, if, for example, if you placed a hub right here, you could basically take any method of transport and link it up to something else in order to spread supply far more efficiently than it otherwise would. Because in a circle around a supply hub, there is a very quick degradation of how fast supply actually gets out. Roads and rails circumvent that by very effectively transporting it. As we can see, so nothing here is actually producing any supply because it's not built yet. But you can see here very clearly, like, there's no supply right here. There's not as much supply in locations even that have industrial hubs where there are no roads. But locations like this, you can kind of distinctively pull out, you know, comparing here to here, that where there are roads, there is more supply than where there is not a road. So then the most effective way to move your supplies becomes to connect them via roads and rails to wherever you want the supplies to reach, or otherwise you just need to get the supply production closer to a hub. With roads and rails, simple towns, cities, and villages can supply areas around them very efficiently. And every hex can be connected by a rail or road if you're crazy enough. They're not just useful for projecting supply farther, they're useful for reducing the negative effects that terrain has on the movement of supply to begin with, as should be evident in this desert mountain range here. And in the background of the game, supply is always generating and it's always moving. Your facilities are always using it, but they don't delete it from a hex. They don't consume it, so to say. They're just always actively feeding off of it. Units, on the other hand, actually do consume it and lower it. So for example, a 12% supply hex is not a very good position to do battle. This area could rapidly run out of supply and start looking more like this if you're shooting on it for long enough and drawing supplies, or even moving through it and drawing fuel. When this happens, you would need to retreat to a nearby road or supply depot in order to actually refuel or rearm, or you'd have to wait for the supply to catch up and refill itself, which, as I just explained, is based on your existing infrastructure or incoming infrastructure. Otherwise, you could send supply units out to do the job for you. Supply units will not refill a hex, by the way. They will just refill anything on the hex. Let's say you take a hex from a nearby nation. So for example, we can see there's amazing supply over here by Niagara Falls. At Niagara Falls, if you step over and actually claim this part of Niagara Falls from Canada, the supply here will actually be reduced down to 0 because the enemy supply has been kind of retreated with them. Your supply is here. It has not caught up yet. After you take a hex, it will require a full day before any supply moves over to the new hex. And by a full day, I don't mean 24 hours, I just mean the game day has to actually end and a new one has to begin for supply to move, as that is when supply moves. So while you're fighting a war, and if you're rapidly advancing, that means you're also probably shooting in hexes that have no supply. So if you're very, very successful in moving like crazy, it's very, very likely that your units are going to run out of supply very quickly as you move through your objectives. Meaning you really would have to support them with supply units, otherwise you would have to intentionally move slower in order to wait for your supply to catch up from the rear, or somehow cycle your units to take the most advantage of their existing reserves. One other thing to note in regards of supply are there are some locations in this game that simply do not have supply. For example, regions that are isolated. Like this island in older scenarios, but there's actually like a city here now. If we go further to Alaska, this could be right here an especially tricky place to get supply, because you have a region where there is no pre-existing infrastructure to build upon in order to spread supply. There is a way around this, and that is with engineer units. If you brought an engineer unit over here, regardless of supply or not, you could build up any base complexes that could start supply generation on these hexes within one hex of the engineer that you brought over here. Otherwise, do note, you will need supply to begin building facilities anywhere. That's really the only instance where facilities need supply other than to have any amount of production. And do note, just as stacking engineers on a hex in order to speed up production is a thing, so too is the amount of supply in an area somewhat relevant for the speed at which it takes to actually produce something. If there's very little supply in an area, progress will go very slowly. If there's a lot of supply in an area, it will move actually according to plan, as you might expect. And if you're trying to build roads into a frontier like this, you'll run into the problem where supply has to catch up to every new road, as it will slowly pour in the construction materials to actually build the facilities, or in this case, transport infrastructure that you're building. There's a lot of strategy for how to use supplies to enhance your facilities, production, building, units, and just overall situation. But aside from the way that you can most effectively spread it from a hex into an area, which I've already covered, that is pretty much what there is to talk about when it comes to the topic of supply. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you guys want to see more videos, especially like this, consider leaving a super thanks on the video below, or checking the description to become a financial supporter. Through one of the options in the description, you will gain access to weekly shoutouts, among other benefits, with most options being just $2 a month. If you need help with any more guides, please shoot your ideas down in the comments so I know what you guys might want to see in the future. A big shout out will be appearing on the screen for all the supporters at the time of this recording. And for now, thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.